Hello. So in this writing notes video, we're going to talk about two really important concepts that are pretty foundational to rhetoric, or at least to rhetorical analysis and evaluation. And those are the ideas of the rhetorical situation and the fitting response. So first we have to understand the rhetorical situation. And this is basically a fancy rhetorician's way of saying the context. Now, the context may not clear things up much more for you if I just say it's the context. That may not tell you much more than just saying the rhetorical situation. So what does it mean? What do I mean by the context or by the rhetorical situation? Well, so you're thinking about a bunch of different elements, all of the different elements surrounding a piece of rhetoric, surrounding a text that attempts to persuade someone. So you're thinking about who the author is, what their motives are, what their goals are, or what they hope to achieve. You're thinking about their position in society, their position relative to their audience, etc., etc. So you're getting a good, solid picture of this author. You're also thinking about the audience that they're addressing. So who is the audience? What are their values? What are the characteristics of this audience? What are their attitudes toward this speaker? What are their attitudes toward what they're being asked to do? Are they likely to support this author or oppose this author? Are they likely to be sympathetic to what they're asked to do, or are they likely to be opposed to it? You're also thinking about the message itself. So what sort of argument, or what's the purpose of this text? Is it to make an argument? Is it to inform? Is it to persuade? Is it to entertain? What's the goal? What change is it trying to make in the audience or in the world? What's its purpose? You're also thinking about the types of evidence that this text uses. You're thinking about the argumentative strategies. So everything about that text. But then you're also thinking about a broader context. So what's the political situation? What's the cultural situation? What's the economic situation? What's the legal situation? Whatever of that stuff is relevant. So all of that surrounds a particular rhetorical act, a particular rhetorical text. So it's not just, here's an audience, here's a speaker, here's a message. It's also what exists in the world around them. So for instance, if you're thinking about Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, one of the most famous pieces of rhetoric of the 20th century. Not only do you have to think about who's Martin Luther King Jr., what are his goals, what's his ethos. Not only do you have to think about who is he addressing, why is he addressing them, what does he want them to do. Not only do you have to think about what is he saying, how is he saying it, what evidence is he presenting. You also have to think about what's the social situation. So what is the context of Jim Crow America? What's the context of segregated America? You have to think about the political situation. What's the context of the struggle for power between segregationists and civil rights activists? How are these people clashing? Who are their allies? Who are their opponents? What groups are sympathetic to their various causes, etc., etc. You have to think about the economic situation. How did African Americans in the early to mid 20th century experience themselves as economic subjects? You have to think about the gendered context. What does it mean to be both African American and female as opposed to African American and male? Because these are different experiences, and King has to address them in different ways. So this is the rhetorical situation. is basically everything in the world related to this rhetorical act, related to this text. You need to understand the idea of the rhetorical situation to understand the idea of a fitting response, because a fitting response assesses how effectively a piece of rhetoric is shaped for that rhetorical situation. So, if we stick with King's I Have a Dream speech, the question, we can't really ask the question, is this rhetorically effective? The question doesn't have enough context. And I think I've talked about this in other videos. There's no such thing, realistically, as a general audience. And I've definitely talked about that in another video. But there's no such thing as a general audience. Every audience has distinct characteristics that shape the way that they're going to respond to a particular speaker, to a particular message, to a particular call to action, whatever it is. So an NAACP meeting is going to respond differently to King's speech than a Klan meeting. These are both audiences that existed in the 1960s when King made his speech, but these are very different audiences. What King would have to do to persuade an NAACP audience is very different than what he would have to do to persuade a Klan audience. I'm not sure if he could persuade a Klan audience, but we'll set that issue aside. So a fitting response is a rhetorical document, a rhetorical text that is shaped specifically for its particular audience, for its particular purpose, its particular time period, its particular context. Which again means you need to understand all of those things. You need to understand everything, or as much of the rhetorical situation as you can, in order to assess not just, is this persuasive in some abstract sense, but is it persuasive specifically for the people that this author or speaker is talking to or writing to in the specific context that they're speaking and writing. So King is speaking in 1963 to, if we assume that his primary audience is African Americans, that's a very specific audience in a very specific context, and there are things that King does that shape that speech for that audience in that context. That same speech would not necessarily work, say, in contemporary Hong Kong, in their struggle for autonomy and democracy against the People's Republic of China. That same speech would not be as rhetorically effective because the situation is different, the audience is different, the purpose is different. And so if we were looking at contemporary Hong Kong, we would need a different rhetorical text to be a fitting response. So this is sort of the idea, is, and this is, in this sense, the idea of a fitting response is useful for rhetorical analysis and especially for evaluation, because you're looking at how effectively this text is shaped for its specific audience, purpose, and context. How effectively this is put together for the specific people that are being addressed. And that's the idea of a fitting response, is that this is something that's shaped effectively for the rhetorical situation.